It was the summer of 1946, and along the Mississippi River in the small Iowa city of Dubuque, the Canfield Hotel stood quiet in the early hours of a Sunday night, its guests asleep in their rooms, a few last drinks being finished in the lounge downstairs. The kind of ordinary stillness that settles over a hotel when the day is done and there is nothing left to wait for. Inside a closet on the ground floor, something had begun to burn, slowly and without announcement, growing in the dark while the building slept around it, and by the time anyone fully understood what was happening, the fire had already claimed the corridors above and sealed the fates of the people trying to find their way out. Before the sun came up that morning, 19 people were dead. What this documentary is really about is not the fire itself, because the fire lasted only a few hours, but about every decision that made it inevitable. Decisions made not on that particular night, but across years and decades embedded in the walls and ceilings and stairwells of a building that had been failing its guests long before a single flame appeared. To understand what happened at the Canfield, you first have to understand the world in which it existed. Because the Canfield was not an anomaly, it was a product of its time, its city, and its era. And all three of those things shaped what it became. Dubuque sits on a limestone bluff above the Mississippi River, in the far eastern corner of Iowa, a city built on the logic of the river, where goods came in and went out, and the working waterfront set the rhythm of daily life. In the middle of the 20th century, it was an industrial town with foundries, meat-packing plants, and a downtown that served the commerce moving through it, not glamorous, not famous, but genuinely prosperous, and like every prosperous American city in the years after the Second World War, it had hotels that served the traveling salesmen and returning veterans and business people who kept the economy moving. Among those hotels, the Canfield was the address, the place you stayed if you were in Dubuque for anything that mattered. The building had stood at the corner of West 4th Avenue and Central Avenue since 1891, when it opened as the Hotel Paris, a four-story wood-frame structure that offered its guests views of the Mississippi from the upper floors and a standard of service that was, by the measure of its time, entirely respectable. It operated that way for more than 30 years without significant incident, until the Canfield family arrived in the 1920s and saw in the old Paris something that could be remade into something larger. William Canfield Sr. was a hotelier with experience managing properties across several Midwestern cities, a man who understood what a good hotel required and who had the ambition and the capital to pursue it. And when he purchased the building outright in 1925 and renamed it the Hotel Canfield, he immediately set about an expansion that would nearly double the property's capacity and, in the process, create the architectural contradiction at the heart of this entire story. The expansion Canfield undertook was the addition of a six-story annex attached directly to the original four-story building and built to the most current standards available. Brick and concrete construction, fire-resistant materials throughout, a genuinely modern structure that could withstand the spread of flame in a way that the old Paris section never could. By the late 1920s, the combined hotel had grown to over 200 rooms, with a new ballroom and a lobby that gave the impression of a unified, polished establishment, and to any guest checking in for the night, there was nothing in the experience of walking through the front door that suggested the building they were entering was actually two completely different structures pressed together at the corridor, built 35 years apart to two entirely different standards of fire safety, sharing the same hallways and the same stairwells while representing two entirely different realities about what would happen if something went wrong. The old section, the original Paris Hotel, was a wood-joisted brick building in the truest sense. Its internal structure was combustible. Its stairwells were open from the ground floor to the top, without any barrier to prevent the vertical travel of heat and smoke, and the single fire escape serving that portion of the building was a single external metal staircase whose base sat directly beside the entrance to the tap room on the ground floor. There were no automatic fire doors between floors, no sprinkler system anywhere in the building, and no automatic alarm that would alert anyone if a fire began in the night. What there was, added sometime in the 1930s as a cosmetic improvement to make the aging corridors look more contemporary, was a drop ceiling throughout the old section made of fiberboard panels fixed in place with flammable adhesive, a material that was inexpensive and visually effective, and that, when fire touched it, would not simply burn at the point of contact, but would carry flame horizontally across its entire surface, with a speed that completely defied what anyone standing in those corridors would have intuitively expected. None of these features were unusual for the era, and that is precisely the point, because what made the Canfield dangerous was not that it was exceptional, but that it was typical, one of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of American hotels that had been caught between two economic disasters and emerged from them structurally compromised in ways that were invisible from the outside. The Great Depression had effectively frozen capital investment across the entire hotel industry for more than a decade, and then the Second World War had made building materials scarce and redirected what was available toward the war effort. So that by the mid-1940s, the typical American hotel was an aging structure that had received almost no meaningful maintenance or structural improvement in 15 years, dressed up with inexpensive cosmetic work to stay competitive while its fundamental fire safety performance quietly deteriorated. Fire engineering professionals had documented the risks of open stairwells and combustible interior finishes in hotels. The relevant journals had run articles making the case for mandatory sprinkler systems, but the enforcement of fire codes was inconsistent and underfunded, left largely to individual municipalities, without the political will to impose expensive retrofits on the local businesses that contributed to their prosperity. And so the hotel industry's effective lobbying against sprinkler requirements had held the line, and buildings like the Canfield continued to stand and serve their guests until June of 1946. On the evening of June 9th, the Canfield Hotel was carrying nearly 150 guests across its 200 rooms, most of whom had retired for the night by the time the cocktail lounge on the ground floor of the old section, a wood-paneled room called the Red Lounge, was winding down toward closing. The bar staff was going through the familiar end-of-service routine, clearing tables, wiping the bar, settling up, a routine so established and so unremarkable that it required no particular thought, and one of its most ingrained habits was the method used for clearing the ashtrays. Waitresses had been trained to collect the cigarette butts from the tables, wrap them in paper napkins, and deposit them in a paper trash can stored inside a small closet off the lounge. Burning tobacco does not always go out when it is covered. Under the right conditions, it can continue smoldering invisibly for an extended period, generating heat and consuming whatever combustible material surrounds it without producing enough visible flame or smoke to attract attention from the outside. And on that particular Sunday night, inside a closed closet lined with wood paneling, the conditions were exactly right. The fire grew slowly in the dark while the lounge operated around it until just after midnight, when 4 guests who had lingered over their drinks decided to go play the jukebox and, crossing the room, heard a crackling sound coming from the direction of the closet and smelled the unmistakable sharpness of something burning. When one of them pulled the closet door open, the wall inside was already on fire, and what came next was the sequence of decisions that would determine how many people lived and how many died before the morning. The hotel manager was summoned, and he arrived quickly with a wet towel and a fire extinguisher, and the guests and the manager together made a genuine attempt to put the fire out, an attempt that failed completely, because by the time they were working on it, the flames had already traveled from the closet wall to the combustible paneling of the bar itself, and once they reached those surfaces, the fire began feeding on the wooden bar fittings, the upholstery of the seating, the wall coverings, and the fiberboard ceiling overhead, which caught and began distributing heat and flame horizontally across its entire surface in a way that rapidly outpaced anything that could be addressed with a fire extinguisher and a wet cloth. The manager's next decision, the one that would later be examined in the most detail and with the most regret, was to continue handling the situation internally rather than immediately calling the fire department, choosing instead to alert the guests on the upper floors himself, moving from floor to floor on foot, knocking on doors, while the fire below went on growing unchecked and uncontested. It was not until 29 minutes after the fire was first discovered that the night clerk finally picked up the telephone and placed the call that brought the Dubuque Fire Department to West 4th Avenue, 29 minutes during which the lounge had been consumed. The lobby had filled with smoke, and the open stairwells had been acting as vertical chimneys, drawing superheated gases and toxic smoke upward through the old section of the building at a rate that had already made survival impossible for guests who were still sleeping on the upper floors, overcome before they ever had the chance to understand what was happening around them. The story of a man named Stanley Shipsky, who had traveled from Minneapolis for business, distills everything that was wrong with the Canfield Hotel into a single unbearable sequence. 2 weeks before his arrival, Shipsky had written a letter to the hotel management requesting a room on the second floor, explaining that he had been in hotel fires before and believed that a lower floor offered the best chance of escape if something went wrong. He had thought about the risk, he had planned his response to it, and he had taken the concrete step of securing what he believed to be the safest available position in the building, and the hotel had honored his request, given him exactly the room he asked for. And on the night of June 9th, Stanley Shipsky died in the flames on the second floor of the Canfield Hotel, not because he was unlucky, or careless, or unprepared, but because no amount of individual preparation could have overcome the structural reality of a building that had been quietly accumulating its failure conditions for years before he ever walked through the door. The Dubuque Fire Department received the alarm at 12:39 in the morning and moved fast, 3 pump engines, an aerial truck, 17 men responding in the first wave, with Senior Captain Harold Cosgrove on the lead engine, and Cosgrove would later say that his crew picked up the smell of the smoke when they were still 2 full blocks from the hotel, and that when they turned the final corner and saw the building for the first time, there was an immediate, shared understanding among every man on that engine that they had pulled into something that would test everything they had. Flames were already pouring from the entire ground floor of the old section, consuming the street-level facade in a rolling mass of heat and light, and the single fire escape that was supposed to provide the guests of the old section with their route to the ground was completely engulfed, enveloped from its base, where it met the tap room entrance, all the way up to the point where it connected with the upper floors, cutting off the one designated external exit before the fire department had even arrived on scene. Cosgrove sounded a third alarm immediately, every available crew, every available piece of equipment, and then began to move around the building to assess what he was actually dealing with, and what he found at every window was the same desperate picture. Guests leaning out into the night air, smoke rolling up from over their heads, some waving pillowcases to attract attention, some screaming, one man hanging from a third-floor window by his hands who dropped before anyone below could reach him and survive the fall. The guests on the lower floors of the old section who had been closest to the fire had already been overtaken by it, unable to escape through the burning corridors below them, while those on the upper floors were confronting a different but equally lethal problem. The open stairwells had behaved exactly as physics predicted they would, channeling the heat and toxic gases from the ground floor upward through the building like a flue, so that the smoke reached the upper corridors and the rooms of sleeping guests before the fire itself arrived, killing people who never had time to fully understand that anything was wrong. Cosgrove made the decision that would define the entire night. He ordered one of the engine company officers to abandon the hose line he was preparing to run, and instead retrieve the life net from the truck. A circular net stretched across a metal frame that was designed to be held at shoulder height by a group of firefighters beneath a window, giving a person who jumped something to land in rather than pavement, a piece of equipment the department had trained with and maintained, but never deployed in a real emergency. He then turned to the crowd of civilians who had gathered in the street outside the hotel and asked for volunteers to help hold the net, and approximately 10 people stepped forward without hesitation. And before the net had even been fully raised to working height, a woman on the third floor jumped, and they caught her, and then the next person came down, and then the next. And the operation that followed over roughly the next 10 minutes became something that Cosgrove and every firefighter who was present would spend the rest of their careers struggling to fully describe. 27 people were caught in that single net during those 10 minutes, the highest number of rescues ever accomplished with a single life net in the history of American firefighting, with Cosgrove directing its repositioning constantly around the perimeter of the building as people came from different floors and different windows, the net holders adjusting their positions in near-zero visibility as smoke poured down around them. The civilian volunteers staying at their posts despite being struck repeatedly by luggage thrown from the upper windows, by guests who were either trying to lighten their fall or had simply lost the capacity for rational action in the terror of what was happening around them. People came down in every configuration imaginable. One woman kicked off her slippers before she jumped and completed what Cosgrove later described as a full double somersault on the way to the net. A man on the 4th floor pushed his wife from the ledge first, then threw his suitcase into the net, and then jumped onto the suitcase and broke his back. 7 of the net holders were injured by the impact of falling luggage alone, and one received a deep laceration from being kicked by a jumper who rebounded sharply off the net's surface. The catches from the 5th and 6th floors were the most violent. The impact forces at those heights bent the iron frame of the net, and a man who came from the 6th floor told Cosgrove afterward that standing at his window, the net below had looked no larger than a silver dollar, and that when he hit it, it had felt like a feather bed, a description that Cosgrove accepted with quiet skepticism given that the man had arrived at the hospital with a broken leg and a fractured pelvis. On the south side of the building, Cosgrove encountered the moment he described later as the one he could not set aside. A grandmother standing at a third-floor window with a small child held on the windowsill in front of her, the net positioned below. The firefighters ready, Cosgrove pleading with her to push the child out first and then follow, and the grandmother looking down at the ground and at the child, and then slowly pulling the child back inside the room and slumping to the floor, and neither of them came out. Across the building, the ladder operation was running in parallel. 21 people brought down over the course of roughly 40 minutes. A slower, more technically demanding process that required the aerial to be repositioned multiple times to reach different windows, while inside, guests who still had time and clearance were tying bed sheets into ropes and lowering themselves hand over hand. And others were navigating through the smoke toward the roof and from there crossing to the modern annex, where the fire doors between the two sections of the building were doing exactly what they had been designed to do, holding the fire back, protecting the concrete and brick wing, and ensuring that every single guest in the 6-story modern annex survived the night without exception. The door between the old section and the new acting as the precise physical boundary between the people who died and the people who walked away. William Canfield Sr., who had built the hotel and whose name was on the building, died in the fire, and his wife, who was pulled from the building alive, died from her injuries on the way to the hospital, and their son William Jr., who was also inside the hotel that night and survived with severe burns, was too badly hurt to attend either of his parents' funerals in the days that followed. By 3 in the morning, the fire was under control. The old section, a gutted shell with 4 interior floors, collapsed into the basement, making the search for any remaining victims impossible until the walls could be shored up, and 9 pieces of apparatus and 57 firefighters had worked through the night on a rescue that produced 27 lives from a single net, 21 more from ladders, and a final death toll of 19 people alongside more than 30 severe injuries, numbers that Cosgrove, speaking about the fire afterward, refused to frame as anything other than a reckoning with a building that had been given every opportunity to kill people and had finally taken it. In the days after the fire, investigators from the Iowa State Fire Marshal's Office and national fire safety organizations moved through the wreckage of the old section and undertook the methodical, unglamorous work of reconstructing what had happened, not just the sequence of events, but the underlying physics and architecture that had allowed a fire starting in a small lounge closet to kill 19 people in a hotel where the vast majority of guests, a question whose answer turned out to illuminate not just the Canfield but an entire generation of American buildings. The origin was established without ambiguity: the smoldering cigarette butts in the paper trash can inside the red lounge closet. It continued burning after the lounge closed, igniting the wall of the closet from inside a confined space, and the fire had grown there unseen and undetected before making its way into the lounge itself. The cause, improperly discarded smoking material, was described in the official findings as a routine housekeeping practice gone wrong, which was technically accurate but also something of an understatement, because what the findings actually revealed was that the hotel's established practice of collecting cigarette butts in paper containers had been creating the conditions for exactly this kind of fire every single night for years. And the only reason it had not happened before was that on all the previous occasions the tobacco had in fact gone out. The fire had always been possible. On June 9th, it was simply not stopped. What the investigators found more significant than the origin was the behavior of the building once the fire was established, because that behavior revealed structural characteristics that had contributed to the death toll in ways that went far beyond the immediate cause. The fiberboard ceiling throughout the old section had acted as a horizontal accelerant, carrying flames across entire floor ceilings simultaneously and compressing the warning time available to guests to a fraction of what a conventional fire spread would have allowed. By the time someone on an upper floor could smell the smoke, the ceiling of the floor below them was already fully involved, meaning that the fire's arrival on any given floor was not preceded by the gradual escalation that might give a person time to collect themselves and make for an exit, but came instead as a near-simultaneous event across a wide area. The open stairwells had behaved with equal predictability, funneling heat and gases vertically through the building the moment the ground floor became established as a fire zone, reaching the upper corridors with the speed of a chimney draft and killing people who were asleep, and had no physical warning, no smoke alarm, no automatic system of any kind, to prompt them to act before they were overcome. The 29 minutes between the discovery of the fire and the call to the fire department were examined in detail, and investigators were direct about what that delay represented in terms of lives. A fire that had been reported immediately upon discovery would likely have been contained by arriving crews to the ground floor and the lounge before the stairwells had carried it upward and before the fiberboard ceiling had distributed it horizontally across the upper floors. The delay was not the result of malice or indifference on the part of the hotel staff. It was the result of a completely understandable human impulse to try to manage a problem before escalating it. But in the context of a building with no sprinklers and no barriers to vertical fire travel, 29 minutes was not a margin of caution. It was the difference between a contained fire and a fatal one. The survival of the modern annex, which the investigation documented in detail as the single most instructive element of the entire event, demonstrated with perfect clarity that the technology to prevent what had happened at the Canfield already existed and was already present in the building, on the correct side of the fire doors. The concrete and brick annex had not burned, its guests had not died, and the structural elements that protected them, enclosed construction, fire-resistant materials, doors that closed and held, were not experimental or theoretical but were the standard of modern building practice, available to anyone who chose to use them and enforced by no one who had the authority to require it. Investigators noted with particular emphasis that the line between survival and death in the Canfield Hotel that night was, in the most literal physical sense, a set of doors that worked in a section of the building where someone had seen to it that they existed. Captain Cosgrove addressed a statewide fire training conference in the months after the fire and delivered an account of the night that was notable for its deliberate avoidance of anything that sounded like pride. He was precise about what the department had done and honest about where they had fallen short, and he made it clear that he regarded the loss of 19 lives as a failure of the community's preparedness rather than a vindication of its response. Any community that ends a night with 19 dead has nothing to celebrate regardless of how many were saved. He was not making excuses, and he was not interested in assigning blame to the hotel staff or the building's owners or the fire code enforcement system, though the evidence would have supported all three. He was making a single direct argument that he wanted every firefighter in the room to carry back to their own towns, that an unsprinklered hotel full of sleeping guests is a building waiting for a specific kind of night, and that what happened in Dubuque could happen anywhere that had the same building and the same set of circumstances, because it was not Dubuque's failure, it was everyone's failure, distributed across an entire industry and an entire regulatory culture that had chosen, year after year, not to fix the problem until the problem fixed itself on someone's shift. The fire was voted the biggest news story in Iowa that year, and its presence on the front page of the New York Times the morning after ensured that the question Cosgrove was raising inside a fire training conference was simultaneously being raised in living rooms and hotel lobbies across the country. The Canfield fire did not exist in isolation, and to understand what it ultimately meant, not just for Dubuque, but for every hotel in North America, you have to see it as one event in a sequence that unfolded across a single calendar year with an insistence that eventually made the necessary response unavoidable. That sequence had begun 4 days earlier and 300 miles to the east, with a fire at the LaSalle Hotel in Chicago that killed 61 people in a building that had been called the largest and safest hotel west of New York when it was built. Any community that ends a night with 19 dead has nothing to celebrate regardless of how many were saved. He was not making excuses, and he was not interested in assigning blame to the hotel staff or the building's owners or the fire code enforcement system, though the evidence would have supported all three. He was making a single direct argument that he wanted every firefighter in the room to carry back to their own towns, that an unsprinklered hotel full of sleeping guests is a building waiting for a specific kind of night, and that what happened in Dubuque could happen anywhere that had the same building and the same set of circumstances, because it was not Dubuque's failure, it was everyone's failure, distributed across an entire industry and an entire regulatory culture that had chosen, year after year, not to fix the problem until the problem fixed itself on someone's shift. 2 hotel fires in the same week, both beginning in cocktail lounges, both traveling upward through open stairwells, both killing sleeping guests in buildings that had been trusted with their safety and had failed to deserve that trust. The repetition was not lost on anyone who was paying attention. And in June of 1946, a great many people were paying attention, asking the question that the 2 fires together made impossible not to ask: how many other buildings and how many other cities had been built the same way and were waiting for the same night? The answer was not reassuring, and the political momentum for reform was genuine, but the machinery of regulatory change moves slowly and requires a sustained level of public pressure to overcome the institutional resistance of established industries. And what the fires of June 1946 produced was a strong argument. Strong enough to be heard, not yet strong enough to be fully acted on. The argument needed one more event to become undeniable, and that event arrived on December 7th. The Weinkauf Hotel occupied 15 floors on Peachtree Street in Atlanta, Georgia, and it had been built in 1913 with a designation that its owners had promoted without reservation for more than 3 decades: absolutely fireproof. The word was not marketing hyperbole, it was an architectural claim, a specific representation that the building's steel structure met the standard of fire-resistant construction, and guests who checked into the Weinkauf did so understanding, or believing they understood, that they were sleeping in a building designed specifically to protect them from the thing that had killed people at the LaSalle and at the Canfield. There were no sprinklers in the Weinkauf. There were no fire escapes. There was a single stairway serving all 15 floors, and when a fire started in a 3rd-floor corridor in the early hours of December 7th, most likely from a discarded cigarette, it entered that stairway and behaved in precisely the way that anyone who had studied the LaSalle or the Canfield would have expected. It rose, it spread, it trapped everyone above it, and it killed 119 people, including the hotel's elderly owners and 30 high school students from across Georgia who had come to Atlanta for a youth leadership program and had been placed by the adults responsible for their care. in a building whose central architectural feature was a single stairwell that functioned, under fire conditions, as a direct path from the source of the flame to every floor above it. A photograph taken that night of a woman leaping from an upper window was distributed by wire services to newspapers across the country and won the Pulitzer Prize the following year. It was an image that made argument unnecessary. 3 fires in 1 year, across 3 different American cities, killing nearly 200 people in hotels that had been trusted by their guests and had proven that trust to be misplaced. And the pattern running through all 3 was identical: the same open stairwells, the same combustible interiors, the same delay in calling for help, the same absence of the automatic systems that would have detected the fire and suppressed it before it could travel. The pattern was documented, it was published, it was placed in front of legislators and regulators and fire safety officials at every level of government, and in January of 1947, President Harry Truman called for a national conference on fire prevention that convened in Washington that spring, where he told the assembled delegates that the great hotel fires of the previous year had demonstrated that the country could not afford to entrust its citizens' lives to unsafe buildings. And the conference program called on everyone present to aggressively support what it described as a national war against the growing menace of fire, language that reflected not rhetorical flourish but genuine political momentum that had been building since June and had become, after December, effectively irresistible. What followed was a wholesale revision of the standards that governed how hotels were built and how they were required to protect the people inside them. NFPA 101, the life safety code that served as the foundation of American fire safety regulation, was rewritten to mandate enclosed stairwells in hotels, self-closing fire-resistant doors on every guest room, sprinkler systems in new construction, and combustibility standards for all interior materials that effectively eliminated the class of decorative finishes that had contributed to the rapid spread of fire at the Canfield and the LaSalle and the Weinkauf. States that had never previously enacted statewide fire safety codes began writing them. Municipalities that had relied on inconsistent voluntary compliance began enforcing mandatory requirements, and the hotel industry, which had spent years lobbying against sprinkler mandates on the grounds of cost and disruption, found itself in a political environment where that argument was no longer viable. It was slow, it was imperfect, and in places it took years longer than the evidence demanded, but it came, and it came directly from the weight of what 1946 had produced. And that was never needed again in the same way, because the hotels that might have required it were no longer built to the standard that made it necessary. What the Canfield fire represents, at the distance of 8 decades, is not simply a tragedy in the conventional sense of something that happened, and then was mourned, and then was filed away. It represents a moment at which the accumulated consequences of years of deferred maintenance and inadequate regulation and misplaced trust in the cosmetic appearance of safety finally became visible in a way that could not be managed or minimized or explained away. A moment at which the gap between how a building looked and what it would actually do in an emergency was measured in human lives and placed on the front page of the New York Times. And the country was forced to decide whether it was going to continue accepting that gap or whether it was going to close it. The decision to close it was not made easily or immediately or completely, but it was made, and every fire door in a hotel corridor and every sprinkler head above a hotel bed and every enclosed stairwell that gives a sleeping guest the time to reach safety instead of being overtaken before they can act. All of those things carry somewhere in their origin the weight of what was decided in the aftermath of 1946, and the weight of the 19 people who did not walk out of the Canfield Hotel in Dubuque, Iowa, on the morning of June 10th. Harold Cosgrove ended his presentation to the fire training conference with a single sentence that he offered not as a conclusion, but as a warning to every person in the room. A warning that has outlasted the conference and the fire and the building and the era it described. It can happen in your town. He was talking to firefighters. But the statement belongs to everyone because the conditions that made the Canfield Hotel what it was on the night